name is Caleb Morin, age 37, resident of a 2-room log cabin 50 miles north of the Arctic Circle line, near the western edge of the Brooks Range, Alaska. I was born here, raised here, and unlike my parents or my sister, I never left. I suppose that makes me the last one still following the rules. Most people think living in the Arctic is about endurance, keeping warm, keeping fed, keeping sane. But it's really about obedience. The land gives you everything if you obey its limits, and nothing if you don't. That's what my father used to say when he taught me our rules. He wrote them on the inside wall by the stove, burned the edges of the paper so they'd never curl. I still read them every morning before I step outside. Rule 1. Never go out in the white without a line to follow. Rule 2. Never burn green wood. Rule 3. Never trust clear ice in the first thaw. Rule 4. When you hear the wind change, go inside. Rule 5. If the dogs start barking at nothing, stay still. He didn't invent them. They were passed down, like the cabin, like the shotgun and the generator and the skinning knives. I've followed them since I was old enough to trap. I've broken one of them once. I still have the scar to remind me which. The cabin stands on a low ridge above the Hula Hula River. It's built from tamarack my grandfather felled himself before the war. Thick logs notched with an axe too heavy for me to lift as a kid. The roof's been replaced twice, once after a heavy snow collapse, once after a bear tore through looking for dried fish. The generator sits under a tin lean. To that rattles all winter, a sound I used to hate and now depend on like a heartbeat. There's no road up here anymore. The old mining trail washed out years ago. The last supply plane came 3 weeks late this fall. They drop sacks of rice, salt pork, batteries, mail, the usual. I haul them in by sled behind the dogs. The pilot waved as he flew off. That's the last face I've seen in 5 months. You get used to solitude faster than you think. It's noise that starts to feel strange. A voice on the radio, a sudden crack of thawing ice, the scrape of metal. Every sound means change, and change usually means danger. Winter has its rhythm. Wake before daylight, feed the dogs, check the fuel, sweep the chimney, mend what's broken. Daylight lasts about 3 hours this time of year, but it's enough to run the trapline. I snowshoe out across the ridge, the dogs panting steam, the light low and blue. The snow reflects everything up here, so even a dull day glows like it's backlit. There's a place I pass where the wind always shifts. A shallow cut between 2 boulders. The dogs hate it. That's where my father once said, "If you ever feel the air go still before a storm, don't argue with it." He didn't mean superstition. Up here, the stillness is physics, temperature inversion, air pressure change. A warning, not a ghost. He was a man of science, but he understood reverence. Most winters I write in the logbook each night, partly for memory, partly to keep my mind straight. You forget what day it is when the sun doesn't rise. This year, the pages feel slower. There's nothing new to say. The ice thickened early, the caribou went east, the generator coughed but held, until the wind changed last week. I heard it before I felt it, the soft groan of pressure shifting, like the world exhaling through its teeth. The dogs went rigid, ears forward, their breath pluming into the dark. The thermometer read -30. I called them back, but they didn't move. They were staring down toward the river where the fog was rolling in, heavier than usual, tinted fade gray instead of white. I went back inside like the rule says. By morning, the fog had frozen to the porch railings. The sound of the ice settling under the cabin was deep enough to vibrate my boots. Nothing unusual, I told myself. Ice does that. Air pockets collapse, water shifts, but something about it. It wasn't random cracking. It came in a rhythm, slow, almost measured. That night, I dreamed of my father for the first time in years. He was sitting by the stove sharpening his knife. "You remember the rules?" He asked without looking up. I said yes, he said. "Then why'd you stop following them in your head?" When I woke, the cabin was colder than it should have been. The stove fire had burned down, but the damper was open. I must have forgotten to close it. I sat up, pulled my parka around me, and realized the silence was off. The generator always hums faintly through the wall. It's like a baseline note. You stop hearing it after a while, but now, nothing. just the ticking of cooling metal. I stepped out to check it, headlamp cutting through the frost haze. The lean-to door hung open. Inside, the pull cord was frozen stiff, the fuel line half disconnected. I could have sworn I'd fastened it last night. It's easy to forget things when it's this cold. The mind goes soft. I reconnected it, primed the pump, and got it running again. Still, I wrote it down in the logbook. Fuel line loose. Possible frost heave. Check again tomorrow. You don't ignore small things here. A loose screw can kill you as surely as a bear. That's one of the unwritten rules. 3 days later, the supply radio crackled for the first time since December. It wasn't the usual scheduled check-in, just static broken by a few half words. I caught Storm Front and West Ridge before it went dead again. I tried replying, but nothing came through. I checked the antenna line and found frost on the connector so thick it looked welded. I scraped it clean and tried again. Nothing. By noon the light dimmed. The sky went from white to steel gray. I hauled extra fuel inside, tied down the shutters, and set a line from the door to the generator shed, another from the door to the dog's enclosure. If the storm hit, I'd need to move blind. Rule 1: never go out in the white without a line to follow. The blizzard came sudden and brutal, as they do up here. Wind at 70 miles an hour, snow like sandpaper. The kind that erases edges. I could hear it punching the cabin walls, feel the pressure drop in my ears. The dogs barked once, then went quiet. It lasted 2 days. During that time, I stayed inside, rationed fuel, melted snow for water. I slept in short bursts, the kind where you wake unsure if it's still night. When it finally eased, I stepped out into a world reshaped. The drifts had swallowed the sled, the lean-to, even half the dog's pen. The line I'd set was buried except for the top strand. Everything was muffled, even the wind. I dug toward the generator shed, cleared the vent, fed the dogs. All but one, Rook, came running. His line was slack, half buried under a drift. I followed it with my mittens, brushing snow aside until it ended at an empty collar. Tracks led away from the pen, shallow and irregular, heading down toward the river. Not wolf tracks, too straight, too narrow. Dog tracks, losing pattern as they went. I followed for maybe 50 yards before the ground sloped toward glare ice. The river hadn't frozen clean. The surface was glassy in places, rippled in others. You could see dark water pulsing beneath. Rook's prints stopped at the edge. I called his name once. The echo came back warped. Maybe it was the ice shifting. Maybe it was me. Either way, I knew better than to go further. Clear ice in the first thaw. Rule 3. I turned back, head down, breath fogging the inside of my mask. Back at the cabin, I wrote another note in the log. Rook lost in storm aftermath. Possible through ice. Do not attempt recovery. I built a small cairn of snow by the pen and left his collar on top. It's not ceremony, just closure. Out here, you mark what's gone so your mind doesn't loop on it. That night, the wind died completely. Absolute silence. No rattle of tin, no shift of logs, no breath from the dogs. I lay awake listening for anything, even the creak of timber. Nothing. Just the weight of air thick enough to hear your own pulse. That's when I realized the stillness wasn't peace. It was warning. Rule 4. I got up, stoked the fire, and checked the shutters again. Everything sealed. Still, the air felt thinner somehow, like pressure dropping before another front. I glanced at the logbook and almost laughed at myself. Writing things down doesn't make them less real. It just makes them orderly. Outside, something settled on the roof with a soft thud. Probably a drift shifting, but I grabbed the shotgun anyway. Old habits. I waited a full minute. Nothing. The stove crackled. My breath fogged in the lamplight. The rules keep me alive. But lately, I've been wondering if they're enough. Because each one ends where the others begin. And none of them say what to do when everything's quiet, and you start hearing your father's voice in the wind, asking if you're still listening. The quiet lasted until dawn, though dawn doesn't mean much up here. The sky went from black to gray, a shade lighter than sleep. I'd been sitting by the stove all night, half dozing with the shotgun across my knees, waiting for a sound that never came. When the lamp guttered, I realized I'd burned through nearly all the kerosene. I marked it in the margin of the logbook: supplies low, watch consumption. When the first faint light hit the snow, I went outside to check the roof. Whatever landed on it had left no trace, just a smooth drift curving over the edge. I cleared it with a shovel, slow and methodical so I wouldn't think too much. That's how you manage fear here, reduce it to a task. The dogs watched me from their pen. 4 pairs of eyes, frost rimming their muzzles. Without Rook, the rhythm felt wrong. They used to bark the moment I stepped outside, eager for feed, but now they were silent, just waiting. I gave them thawed fish, checked their paws, and tied new rope lines to replace the ones frozen stiff. Every movement had to be deliberate. At 40 below, clumsiness is danger. By midday, the wind picked up again, soft at first. I caught myself hoping for it. Silence unsettles more than noise. Wind at least reminds you the world's still breathing. I followed the line to the generator shed to check fuel. It had burned more than expected during the storm. Condensation in the line, probably. I scraped frost from the vent and tapped the gauge. Enough for maybe a week if I rationed power. After that, I'd need to hike 20 miles south to the old mining cache. That thought settled heavy in my chest. The snowpack this year was deep enough to swallow a manhole. Inside, the fire had died down again. I stacked more logs and rubbed my hands in front of the stove. The heat radiated unevenly, one side hotter than the other. The cabin walls creaked in pulses like they were breathing. It's a sound you stop noticing until it stops entirely, then you miss it. The rest of the day passed in small routines, patching a tear in a boot, cleaning the rifle, trimming the dog's nails. The normalcy steadied me until dusk, if dusk is what you call the hour when light drains away and your reflection in the window turns from faint to sharp. That's when I saw something that made me stop mid-motion. Across the river, near the tree line, a single point of light blinked through the fog. At first, I thought it was a trick of the eye, reflected moonlight or ice catching the lamplight. But it pulsed, steady, deliberate. I set down the mug in my hand and stepped closer to the window. The light flashed twice, paused, flashed once more. The pattern was unmistakable, someone signaling. My first thought was another cabin, maybe a stranded trapper or one of the survey teams from Fairbanks. But no one came this far north in winter. I hadn't seen a single aircraft in months. The signals stopped. I grabbed the binoculars from the shelf and wiped the lenses clear. When I looked again, the fog had thickened, the spot of light was gone. I waited 5 minutes, 10-0. The dogs hadn't made a sound, though one of them, Bryn, kept her head low, ears flat. I wrote in the logbook, light seen across river approx 1910. Possible reflection, investigate at dawn. Then I closed the cover and sat back. My father used to say the logbook was the difference between panic and procedure. If you can describe it, you can manage it. Still, sleep wouldn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that pulse of light through the fog. I replayed the pattern in my head, 2 short, 1 long, and realized it wasn't Morse or any signal I knew, just intention. By morning, the temperature had risen slightly, a sign of coming weather. I strapped on my snowshoes, clipped the dogs' harnesses, and set off toward the river with a pack, radio, and rope line. The air had that heavy, metallic taste that comes before a snow. The ice where Rook's tracks ended looked unchanged, slick, faintly blue under the thin daylight. I stayed clear of the edge and followed the bank east, scanning the far side for prints or human signs. Nothing but wind, swept snow, and the faint outlines of spruce. Half a mile upstream, I spotted something dark, half buried in a drift. I thought it was debris from a storm, maybe a branch, but when I brushed the snow away, I saw fabric, nylon, torn, dark green. A piece of a parka hood. The stitching matched the type sold through supply outposts. I pocketed and looked around. No footprints, no tracks of any kind. The surface snow was untouched. It takes only a few hours of wind to erase a trail completely, but still, the edges of that torn hood were too clean. No frost damage yet. It hadn't been here long. The dogs whined softly. I turned back, uneasy, marking the spot in my head. By the time I reached the cabin again, the sky had clouded over entirely. Snow began to fall in slow, heavy flakes, the kind that don't drift. They just descend, straight and certain. That evening, I found myself staring at the wall where the rules were written. The ink had faded over years of smoke. The paper curled slightly at one edge despite my father's burned margins. I traced the first line with a finger. Never go out in the white without a line to follow. I'd kept that one, though it never said anything about following what might already be out there. I pulled out my father's old radio set from under the bunk. It was bigger than mine, older too, but he swore by it. The receiver still worked, barely. I tuned through static until I caught a faint signal. Nothing clear, just a pulse every few seconds. I adjusted frequency. The pulse stayed constant like a beacon or an automatic distress tone. I checked the logbook for old frequencies. He'd written coordinates from a decade ago when a survey plane went down east of here. Same range. I keyed the mic and spoke bass. This is cabin unit Morin. I copy a beacon signal repeating at 12.5 megahertz. Can you confirm? Static swallowed my words, no reply. I logged it anyway, 12.5 minutes, Reperigen unknown. That night, the generator stuttered twice and went quiet. I let it die, fuel was low, and the stove could carry heat through the night. I lay on the bunk listening to the dogs shift in their pen. Then I heard it, a single bark sharp cut off mid-sound. I sat up, heart hammering. Silence followed. I waited a minute too. Nothing. Then another bark farther away. I pulled on boots, grabbed the flashlight, and opened the door. The air was motionless. My breath hung like a cloud. The beam of the flashlight reached maybe 20 feet before dissolving into snow. The dogs were huddled close, eyes reflecting pale light. No sign of movement beyond the fence. Then, from somewhere near the river, a sound, a dull crack, ice shifting, or something stepping where it shouldn't. I held the light steady, but it showed only falling flakes. The wind picked up again, brushing snow off the roof. I called once toward the dark. The echo came back faint, broken. I backed inside and bolted the door. When I turned around, something on the table caught my eye. The parka hood I'd found that morning had thawed. Beneath the fabric, half stuck to the ice, was a small metal tag, dog collar size, stamped with letters so worn I had to tilt it to read. ROOK. For a moment I couldn't move. My first thought was that I'd dropped his collar out by the pen and somehow tracked it back in with me. But I'd left it on the cairn. I remembered that clearly, the way the frozen strap had cracked when I set it down. I sat down, breathing slow, steadying myself. There are logical answers for everything if you look long enough. The storm could have blown snow, unearthed the collar, carried it downstream. The river moves strange under ice. I wrote it in the logbook to make it true collar recovered downstream. Possible ice displacement. The next morning I dug out the dog's pen again. The drift line was higher than yesterday, meaning wind came from a new direction. South. That's unusual for this valley. I walked to the ridge for a better view. From there you can see 20 miles of river, frozen white and silent. But today, I saw faint indentations tracing the far bank, too long and straight to be animal tracks. Someone had walked upriver recently. I followed with the binoculars until the line vanished into a patch of fog curling between the trees. Just before it disappeared, I saw a darker shape standing still, too tall to be one of the low spruces, too solid to be illusion. The light hit it once, just enough to catch metal on fabric, maybe a zipper glint. Then it turned and walked deeper into the fog. I stayed there a long while, snow collecting on my parka, the binoculars trembling slightly in my gloves. The dogs barked from below, sharp, urgent, then went quiet again. Back at the cabin, I took down the paper of rules and pinned it flat on the table. I added a 6th line beneath my father's neat handwriting, ink pressing hard enough to tear through. Rule 6: never assume you're alone, even when you are. Morning came without a sunrise. The sky had the color of unpolished steel, a dull pressure behind the eyes. I boiled snow for coffee and tried not to think about what I'd seen through the binoculars. The figure on the far bank, the glint of metal. I told myself it could have been a trick of the fog, a bent tree maybe. Anything ordinary. The dogs were restless. They paced their pen in tight circles, tails low, hackles prickling at nothing I could see. When I opened the gate to check their lines, they pressed against me, bodies stiff, eyes darting toward the river. That was enough to tell me something was off. Animals don't lie about danger. I set extra fuel inside, packed a day kit, and debated whether to cross. Every instinct said no. Rule 1, never go out in the white without a line to follow. But the fog had lifted slightly and curiosity has its own weather. If someone was out there, I needed to know who. Out here, mystery can kill just as surely as exposure. I took the sled and 3 dogs, Bryn, Tusk, and Arrow. The others stayed behind, chained for safety. We followed the river east, hugging the near bank. Snow squeaked under the runners, dry as sugar. The air was so cold it glittered. Half an hour in, I spotted something half buried near the ice edge. A line of stakes, maybe 4 feet apart, pointing upriver. Old survey markers, I thought. But when I brushed snow off one, I saw it was newer than it should be. Fresh, cut pine, no rot. Someone had been here this season. The top of each stake had a strip of red fabric tied to it, fluttering faintly. I followed them for 100 yards before they ended abruptly at the frozen bend. Beyond that, the river widened into a basin of thin, cracked ice. I could see water moving underneath in slow, dark currents. That was as far as I could safely go. The dogs pulled toward the opposite bank, whining. Through the haze, I could make out a depression in the snow, maybe a tent site or collapsed drift. I raised the binoculars and scanned it. Flat, white, then something dark at the center. A patch of fabric, a pack maybe. I was about to turn back when a sound cut through the still air. Not wind, not ice. A sharp, deliberate snap like a stick breaking. The dogs froze. I turned the binoculars slowly toward the sound. Between 2 trees on the far bank, a figure stood, still as stone. The same height, same outline as before. Parka hood up, no face visible. I held my breath. The figure didn't move. Then, one arm lifted slow, almost lazy, and pointed, straight toward me. For a moment, I thought the cold had numbed my mind. But no, the motion was real. The hand stayed out fixed, while the rest of the body remained perfectly still. I backed the sled, calling the dogs. Bryn barked once, sharp and low. The figure didn't move. I turned the team around and started back toward the cabin. I didn't look again until we were half a mile away. When I finally did, the figure was gone. Back inside, I unhooked the dogs and checked them over. No injuries, but they refused to eat. Arrow wouldn't even look at me. I latched the pen and went straight to the logbook. The pencil shook in my hand as I wrote, observed human figure on far bank 142. Stationary, unresponsive, possibly delirious traveler. Retreated. Writing it down didn't help this time. It only made it sound more real. I radioed on open channel. Any parties near Hula Hula River, Northern Ridge sector. This is Morin Cabin. Repeat. Any active teams near Brooks Range West Ridge. Static as usual. Then, faintly, a tone. 2 short bursts, 1 long. The same rhythm I'd seen in the flashing light. I turned the dial to check frequency bleed, but the signal followed. I shut it off. The silence afterward felt heavier than before. The rest of the day I kept to small work, fixing the door latch, cutting kindling, clearing drifts. Every task was something to hold on to. I told myself it was probably a lost prospector. Happens more than people think. The kind who wander from oil sites or survey posts, thinking they can find a shortcut south. Maybe he was just waving for help. But that arm, that deliberate motion, by evening, clouds rolled in thick and low, smothering the sky. I stoked the fire and tried to rest, but my nerves kept me alert. Around midnight, the dogs started again. Soft growls, not barking this time. I went to the window. The storm reflected my lamplight back at me, nothing more. Then a faint knock. I froze. It came again. 3 slow taps against the door. Wood on wood, not branches. Deliberate. I raised the shotgun and called out, "Who's there?" My voice sounded strange, too loud in the small room. No reply, just the faint hiss of falling snow. Another knock, same rhythm. I waited a full minute, heart pounding, then east to the door and lifted the latch. The cold rushed in like a breath. The porch was empty. Fresh snow showed no tracks. I swept the beam of my flashlight across the clearing, the sled, and nothing. The dogs were standing rigid, fur bristled, eyes fixed past me toward the tree line. I shut the door fast, bolted it, and turned down the lantern so I could see through the window better. Nothing moved out there. Sleep was out of the question. I sat by the stove until the lamp burned dry, then just watched the ember glow fade. The wind began to rise again around 3 a.m., low and steady, like the world was humming through the walls. When I finally did drift off, I dreamed of the figure again, but this time closer, standing just beyond the porch, arms still raised. In the dream, I stepped forward, and the face under the hood was mine. I woke to gray light and the sound of something scraping outside. The dogs were howling this time, high and sharp. I threw on my coat and boots, grabbed the rifle, and stepped out. The wind had carved new ridges overnight. One of the lines, my safety rope to the generator shed, was taut, stretched out of place. Something had caught it and dragged it 10 feet from its anchor. At the end of the rope was a splintered stake, snapped clean. Snow at the base was churned, not smooth like the rest of the yard. I knelt and brushed at it until my gloves hit something hard metal, dull and round. I lifted it, a spent shell casing, my father's caliber, .30-06. He'd fired the rifle last the year before he died, almost 10 winters ago. I hadn't touched that ammunition since. I kept it sealed in a tin under the bunk. I went inside to check. The tin was open. All 10 rounds were still there. The casing didn't match. Different brand, different crimp. Someone else had been firing near the cabin. The dogs wouldn't calm down for an hour. I fed them extra and stayed outside with them until they stopped shaking. The sound of their chains clinking against the posts was oddly comforting, something constant, alive. Back inside, I took down the rules again. The paper was brittle at the edges. I read them line by line. I'd followed each one, and still the world was closing in. My father always said the rules weren't for controlling nature. They were for controlling us. Keep the mind ordered, the habits fixed, so fear can't slip in. But what happens when the rules themselves start to feel like traps? By afternoon, the sky cleared enough for light to filter through. I decided to test the radio again, this time shortwave. The pulse tone was still there, steady, faint, deliberate. I triangulated roughly by signal strength and direction. It lined up almost exactly with the stretch of river where I'd seen the figure. If someone was hurt, I had to know. Ignoring it would gnaw at me worse than the cold. I packed a rucksack with essentials. First aid kit, fuel tabs, flare, spare radio battery. I left a note in the logbook: going east along river. If not back by nightfall, follow sled tracks. I waited for the wind to ease, then hitched the dogs again. They resisted at first, whining, but settled once the sled moved. We followed the same route as before, the sky flat and unbroken above. Halfway there, I saw smoke, a thin column rising from beyond the bend. My pulse jumped. It was faint but real, the pale gray of burning fuel. We reached the spot where I'd found the parka hood. The stakes were still there, red fabric snapping weakly. Beyond them, a shallow hollow where the snow looked churned. And then I saw it, a tent, collapsed on one side, half covered in drift. The smoke came from a small stovepipe jutting through the fabric, still warm enough to melt frost. I tied off the sled and approached slowly, calling out, "Hello. Cabin unit Moran? Anyone here?" No answer. I circled the tent, rifle ready. The flap had been left open just enough to see inside. A small heater, half-burned fuel brick, sleeping bag unzipped. No one there. On the floor near the entry was a journal, pages stiff with cold. The top one was dated 3 days ago. I brushed frost from the handwriting. Tight, mechanical script. Visibility minimal. Reach coordinates at 69 degrees N. Cabin lights visible across river. Will attempt contact tomorrow. Dog recovered. Collared tag reads raw okay. My breath fogged over to read the rest. I kept reading until the ink blurred under melting frost. The handwriting grew shaky halfway down the page, the lines uneven. Barometer falling. Wind shifting southeast. Set markers to cabin but lost visibility. Ice not stable near bend. Rook responding to whistle. Possible mirage effect. Will hold position until clear. The rest of the line trailed off into a scribble. Beneath it, a single word stood out, pressed harder than the rest. Wait. I set the notebook down. The pages beneath were blank, frozen together. Whoever wrote it had been here recently. Within 48 hours, maybe less. The heater was still warm to the touch, the fuel not completely spent. I stepped outside, scanning the tree line. The smoke from the vent drifted thinly, carried east by a weak wind. No tracks except my own. No sign of anyone returning. The dogs whimpered behind me. I walked a few yards past the tent to a spot where the snow thinned and the river's edge showed through. Faint ice fractures, dark water moving underneath. Something small floated near the rim of the icy, a piece of rope, frayed, tangled around a stake like the ones I'd followed earlier. I pulled it up. It was stiff, knotted with what looked like dog hair. I followed the rope back a few feet until it disappeared under snow. I started digging with my gloves, the motion automatic, until the ground gave way under my weight, and I dropped to one knee. Beneath the crust, the ice was hollow. Inside the cavity, something dark filled with frozen bubbles pressed against the surface. Fabric again, stretched tight over a shape. I didn't look closer. Some things you understand before you see them. I covered it back with snow, breathing through my scarf until the air stopped burning my lungs. Then I turned to the dogs. I said they didn't need telling twice. By the time I reached the cabin, snow had begun again. Thin, horizontal flakes like static. I hauled the sled inside the lean-to, untied the team, and stowed the pack. My gloves stuck to the metal latch from the frost. Inside, the stove had cooled to embers. I knelt, coaxed a new fire to life, and set the journal near the hearth to dry. The cabin smelled of iron and smoke. I sat with my hands on my knees, trying to think through what I'd seen. There were a few possibilities. A surveyor from the oil field, maybe. Someone who tried to cross early and misjudged the ice. The rope might have been a tether line for his dog. That would explain the collar. That would explain everything. But explanations here always sound reasonable until they don't. When the journal was dry enough to handle, I flipped to the front page. The first entry was dated 6 weeks earlier. Team instructed to locate legacy property near Hula Hula River. Structure identified via satellite. Coordinates match record from 1983 expedition. One occupant confirmed by heat signature. My heart stuttered. 1983. My father's handwriting in the old logbook had entries from that year. Notes about survey parties. He never named. He'd mentioned visitors once, years later, in passing. They came looking for something. They never found it. The next line of the stranger's journal said, "Approach route unstable. Will attempt contact when conditions allow. Mission confirm activity. Report to base if unresponsive. Confirm activity." That meant me. I flipped ahead, scanning fragments. Lights from cabin consistent. No response on open frequency. Observed figure near ridge line. Possible occupant. Dog recovered. Tag confirms lineage from more in stock. The handwriting broke there. Letters uneven, pressing harder. The last clear entry was 3 days ago. Sabin light extinguished abruptly, proceeding to investigate at first visibility. After that, nothing. I closed the book and sat back. The fire popped, throwing sparks up the flue. I felt every rule my father had ever taught me hanging in the air between us. They were supposed to keep us alive, but maybe they'd also kept everyone else out. The wind shifted again, rattling the tin on the generator shed. I went to the window. Snow blurred everything past the porch, but I thought I saw a faint glow near the ridge. Yellow, unsteady, moving against the dark. A headlamp, maybe. I turned off the lantern to cut the reflection and pressed closer to the glass. The glow bobbed once, disappeared, reappeared further downslope, then vanished entirely. That was enough. I grabbed the rifle, checked the magazine, and sat by the door until my pulse slowed. My father used to say that patience is survival, that panic makes the cold smarter than you. So I waited. An hour passed, maybe more. Then, faintly through the wind, I heard it 3 taps on wood. I didn't move. A pause, then 3 more a little closer. I eased the safety off and called out, "You need help." Nothing. The next gust of wind drowned everything. I waited 5 minutes, then opened the door an inch. The air outside was white, swirling. No tracks visible. But in the snow on the porch lay something small and metallic, half buried by drift. A radio battery. Same model as the one from my father's old set. I brought it inside, turned it over in my hand. The brand etched faintly along the side. Harris, government issue. It couldn't have been sitting out long, no frost crust, no corrosion. Whoever dropped it had been right here minutes ago. I set it on the table beside the journal. 2 artifacts from strangers who shouldn't exist anymore. Then I did what I always do when thought starts spiraling. I wrote, 1904-5, recovered battery on porch, unknown visitor, possible survivor from field team. Recommend caution, but there was no one to recommend it to. The logbook is both witness and confession. That night I slept in bursts again, rifle propped against the wall. Once, I woke to the generator coughing, once to a thud outside, once to a voice I thought I heard say my name, soft, drawn out, almost kind. When I lit the lamp, the room was empty. At dawn, the air cleared for the first time in days. A thin, pale strip of light stretched across the horizon. I stepped outside, careful to stay within the line. No fresh prints on the porch. The snow had sealed everything. The dogs were quiet. They stared toward the river again, ears twitching. I followed their gaze. A new set of red, topped stakes now marked the near bank, tracing toward the ridge. Someone had been there overnight, planting them. I counted 6 before they vanished behind a drift. They matched the ones I'd seen at the other camp exactly. Same spacing, same height. I followed them to the last visible one, heart thudding slow but heavy. The final stake had a scrap of fabric tied to it, blue this time, not red. Faded letters printed on its URVY, US Geologal Sarvasi. The tag looked decades old. The edges were torn, not weathered, as if it had been ripped from something recently. I looked back toward the cabin. The dogs were restless again, pacing the fence line. Behind them, the chimney smoke rose in a clean column. Everything looked normal, orderly, small. I should have gone back right then, but I kept walking another 20 yards until the snow sloped upward. At the crest, the wind picked up, clearing the surface enough to show a shape half buried in ice. A metal frame rusted, just the corner of it exposed. I brushed snow away until I saw the stenciled letters on the side, USG's 83. It was a crate, long sealed and frozen into the riverbank. I knocked on it with my glove. Hollow. I cleared the rest of the ice with the butt of the shovel until the latch came free. Inside were bundles wrapped in wax cloth. Maps, field notes, reels of old magnetic tape. The labels had faded, but one line was still legible. More in sight. Data log. My father's name. I stared until my eyes burned from the glare. Then I packed the crate as best I could, marked its location with my own stake, and turned back. Whatever this was, it was old. Something my father had buried or someone else had left behind after a failed expedition. Either way, it belonged to the past. By the time I reached the cabin again, the sky had darkened. I fed the dogs, checked the stove, sat at the table with the journal and the crate tag beside me. For the first time in weeks, I felt something like clarity. Every rule, every warning suddenly fitting into one shape. He'd never told me why the rules existed, just that they did. Maybe they weren't about surviving the cold, but about surviving whatever happened the first time someone broke them. I looked at the wall where the rules hung. My new line, never assume you're alone, even when you are, looked almost neat now. Below it, I added one more, the pencil trembling slightly as I wrote. Rule 7, if you find what they left behind, leave it buried. I waited until the wind settled before opening the crate. The waxed bundles peeled apart with a brittle sound, the paper inside stiff as bark. Each reel of magnetic tape was labeled in the same neat block handwriting, USGS Arctic Survey 1983. Some included coordinates. One was marked, audio log. I set it aside. The others were data, temperature charts, barometric readings, seismic readings recorded hourly. My father's handwriting appeared in the margins, sharp and precise. Notes about low-frequency anomalies, ground resonance, magnetic drift, things a geologist would care about, not a survivalist. The more I read, the stranger it seemed. The entries described recurring ground vibrations recorded near the ridge every winter. He'd charted them, noted their intervals, and written, same as last cycle. Another line said, dog agitation corresponds with tremor activity. I leaned back in the chair, rubbing the bridge of my nose. Maybe this was what drove him to write the rules. To keep us steady while he studied something he couldn't fully name. I unwrapped the reel marked audio log. The plastic casing was clouded but intact. I fetched the old player from the shelf, one of those clunky field models that ran off battery or hand crank. My father used to play music on it when the generator failed. The machine whirred alive, static first, then a man's voice, steady, low, familiar. My father, recording December 19th, 1983, Station 3, Hula Hula Sector, barometric stable, wind speed 15 knots south-southwest. Ice crack density at 0.8 per meter. Begin sequence log. His tone was all business, the kind he used when reading weather data. The background hissed with wind. Dog's restless again. Rook keeps pawing at the door. Same as last 2 nights. Could be sent, though nothing in air. Checking generator alignment tomorrow. Note to self: avoid walking on ice after dusk. Surface resonance detected again. There was a pause. Then, quieter. It's not the ice. I froze, hands still on the crank. He let out a breath near the mic. Frequency matches last year's tremor, but source amplitude increased. Can't locate epicenter. Record shows identical waveform every 12 hours. If it were seismic, pattern would decay. This repeats. The sound crackled, a gust hit the mic. Could be equipment malfunction or reflection. We'll compare tomorrow. The tape clicked, then resumed. December 20th, something new. Heard tapping outside at 02 or 10. 3 knocks, paused, 3 again, checked no prints. Same night, generator cut for 4 minutes, resumed without restart. Fuel line intact. Another pause, then a muttered sentence I had to replay 3 times before catching it. If anyone finds this, remember the rules. They're not for the weather. I stopped the player. The tape clicked in the silence, metal cooling. For a long time I didn't move. The fire hissed in the stove. The dog scratched faintly outside. I thought about those words, not for the weather. If not that, then what? I started another tape, one labeled USGS A3B, Ridgeline. The sound was faint at first, just wind and static. Then, buried deep in the noise, a rhythmic thump. Low, repetitive. Like a pulse through the ground. I turned the volume up until the machine buzzed. The thump repeated every few seconds, uneven, almost too slow for the human ear. The dogs began whining outside, claws scraping wood. I shut it off. The silence afterward had weight. I rewound the tape, labeled it, then packed it back with the others. My hands shook slightly, though the room wasn't cold. It wasn't fear exactly, more like recognition. The way you feel when a pattern you've ignored suddenly aligns. I reached for the logbook, 2100. Reviewed 1983 tapes. Recorded patterns recurring every 12 hours. Father notes correspond with current behavior: dogs, wind, generator interference. Possible environmental resonance. Will monitor. Writing it down made me feel sane again. I needed to reduce this to something measurable. At 2112, the stove creaked once. The air pressure shifted in my ears. Outside, the wind died. I looked at the clock. 12 hours since the last storm. Then came a sound, faint but deep enough to feel in the ribs. A distant vibration through the floorboards, not sharp like thunder but rolling steady. I turned off the radio and listened. The dogs had gone silent. The vibration lasted maybe 10 seconds, then stopped. Coincidence, I told myself. Ice settling. Thermal expansion. The kind of thing the cold does. But I couldn't shake the timing. At 21:30, I heard the generator choke and die. I grabbed the flashlight and went outside. The air was thick, still, snow hanging mid-fall like ash. The shed door creaked open under my hand. Inside, the motor was off, the fuel line slack, same as before. I checked the line, tight, no leak. The switch was in off position. Someone had flipped it. I looked down. On the snow beneath the vent was a single footprint. Bare human, half filled with ice crystals. I crouched, tracing it with the light. The toes pressed clean into the snowpack. The arch deep, fresh within minutes. My heart was hammering, but my mind kept trying to catalog. Size, direction, depth. It led away toward the ridge, then vanished in drift. I relit the generator, shut the shed door, tied a double line between it and the cabin. Then I sat by the fire until morning, shotgun across my lap. When light came, I went back out. The footprint was still there, faint now, softening at the edges. I took a photo with the old Polaroid my father kept for survey work. The picture developed slowly, colors bleeding into each other until the print showed the same thing, a bare footprint under a vent pipe. Nothing else. I slipped it into the logbook between pages. The rest of the day passed quiet. Too quiet. The dogs refused food again, lying with noses tucked under tails. The wind didn't rise, the stove drew clean, and the air felt thick with waiting. I forced myself into task mode, inventory, Equipment check, snow depth measurement, anything to fill the hours. But every time I paused, I thought I felt a low hum under the floor. Not sound exactly. Vibration. At 09:15 that night, 12 hours after the last one, it came again. A slow, pulsing tremor through the ground. Same duration. 10 seconds. Then stillness. The dogs started barking, this time wild and sharp. I went to the window. I saw the red-topped stakes on the ridge line tremble, then one by one sink into the snow as if the ground beneath them had softened. When the air cleared again, the line was gone. I didn't write that part down. Some things you record only by remembering. Instead I wrote, C915, recurring vibration, possible permafrost shift, stakes displaced. It was an attempt to make order out of something that refused it. I decided to test the theory. I took one of the USGS recorders from the crate, an old seismic unit powered by battery, and set it up outside the cabin door, sensor pressed into the snow. I set the timer for hourly logs, marked the first entry, and went back inside. Then I waited. At exactly 21:15, the machine clicked, its tiny arm trembling. A low frequency wave registered on the paper spool, a perfect curve. I watched the needle. It rose, dipped, rose again, steady, rhythmic. 10 seconds, then flatline. The reading was real. Whatever it wasn't imagination. Something under the ice was moving at regular intervals. I went to the map pinned on the wall and traced the river's bend. The point where I'd found the tent lined almost exactly with my father's, Station 3. The vibration seemed to follow that path. He'd been measuring it too. Not to understand it, but to know where not to stand. By midnight, I'd made a plan. If it repeated again, I'd follow it upstream, find the source. If it was geological, I could map it, record it, prove it. The need for logic was stronger than fear. I packed light, radio, flare, GPS, extra fuel tabs. The dogs stayed behind. I didn't want to drag them through unknown ice. I followed the line by headlamp, the beam slicing through a pale haze. Each step crunched, steady. The temperature had dropped below -40, the kind that freezes breath to cloth. When I reached the first red stake, I crouched beside it. The air smelled metallic, almost electrical. I waited. At 03:15, right on the mark, the vibration began again, stronger this time. Close enough that snow lifted in faint plumes around my boots. Then silence. I crouched lower, pressed a gloved hand to the ground. The ice beneath was trembling faintly like a pulse under skin. I felt it fade, and for one short second, I thought I heard a sound within it. Not random, not noise. 3 dull knocks, slow and far away, echoing through the ice. When it stopped, the wind came back all at once, a long exhale through the trees. I turned toward home. The cabin was a dim shape in the distance, smoke curling faintly from the chimney. I followed my own tracks back until they merged with others. Not mine. Bare footprints again, half filled with snow, heading straight toward my door. By the time I reached the porch, dawn had bled through the clouds, blue, gray, the color of unpolished steel. My breath fogged the air in short bursts. The bare footprints stopped at the top step. From there, the snow was smooth, undisturbed. I pushed the door open with the rifle ready. The stove fire had died down to coals, the air sharp with cold metal and ash. Nothing moved inside, no sound from the dogs, no creak from the logs. Just the slow tick of the cooling stove. The first thing I saw was the recorder on the table. I'd left it by the door when I went out. Now the lid was open, spool unspooled halfway, paper dragging across the floor. The needles still trembled faintly, though the power light was dead. The last mark on the paper wasn't a smooth curve like before. It was sharp, jagged, a vertical spike at 0325. Then silence. I touched the edge of the tape, still warm. Something had happened while I was outside. I walked through the cabin in slow loops, checking corners, storage under the bunk, nothing. The back door was still bolted, windows intact. I moved to the dog's pen next. Their chains were taut, ice-crusted. All 4 still there, curled into themselves for warmth, eyes tracking me with silent questions. No signs of struggle. I went back in, set the rifle against the wall, and sat at the table. For a while I just listened, to the stove tick, the faint hum of the wind, my own pulse. When thought finally settled, I started sorting through what was left of the USGS materials. The crate had been shifted slightly closer to the door. I told myself I must have nudged it earlier, though the scrape mark in the dust said otherwise. I emptied it out again. Beneath the last layer of maps was a sealed envelope, yellowed and folded, marked in pencil, to be opened only if sight becomes active. The handwriting was my father's. I slit it open with the knife. Inside were 2 sheets of paper, both brittle from age. The first was a memo header, USG's letterhead, dated March 1984. Final status Hula Hula River anomaly. Recommend discontinuation of study due to personnel losses and unstable conditions. Seal site per instruction, all data classified. The signature at the bottom wasn't his. The second sheet was handwritten, short. If you're reading this, the cycle has resumed. Don't follow it. Don't measure it. Leave the ridge untouched. The ground is not dead. It only sleeps. That line hit me harder than it should have. I read it 3 times before folding the page back up. My father wasn't a man of metaphor. He wrote in numbers, not riddles. If he'd called the ground sleep, it was shorthand for pressure movement, something measurable. But I couldn't ignore the phrasing. I took the recorder spool and laid it beside the note. Side by side, they looked like 2 halves of the same confession. One measured, one human. The rules on the wall suddenly felt smaller than they used to. I stoked the fire, brewed coffee, sat down to think. Every instinct said to leave. Follow the supply line south. Signal for pickup when the weather broke. But there's a pull in solving what someone else feared. Maybe it's ego or loyalty, or the need to make the story make sense. By midday, the wind had died again. The kind of stillness that makes sound travel strange. I went out to check the seismic unit by the door. The sensor was gone. Cable cleanly severed, no tracks leading away. I stared at the snow until my eyes watered. Then I noticed the faintest depression leading not outward, but inward, toward the crawlspace vent beneath the cabin. The gap was small, barely a foot wide, covered with a metal grate. Frost rimmed the edges. I knelt, brushed it clear, and saw the grate was unlatched. A smear of something dark, soot or dirt, traced the corner. I hesitated, then lifted the cover. Inside was darkness and a faint smell of iron. The crawlspace stretched maybe 6 feet deep, low enough that you had to lie flat to see under it. I shone my flashlight in. Nothing but packed snow and wood beams. Then the light caught a corner of metal, the sensor unit. Dragged halfway in, I reached for it. My glove brushed something soft cloth, a parka sleeve. I jerked back, heart slamming. The sleeve was empty, attached to nothing. Torn clean at the shoulder seam. Same green nylon as the tent. I sealed the vent again, bolted it tight, and went back inside. I built the fire high, heat be damned. The cabin filled with the crackle of resin. That night I logged everything, every detail. Sensor removed from position, found under cabin. Partial fabric match to prior site. No sign of entry otherwise. Recommend structural inspection come spring. But I knew there'd be no inspection. No one was coming. I sat there until the page blurred. When I looked up, the room had changed temperature, the kind of shift you feel more than sense. The fire was still bright, yet my breath fogged faintly. The floorboards creaked under a pressure I couldn't place. Then the generator coughed. Once, twice, stopped. I didn't move. A low, rolling vibration passed through the floor. 10 seconds long, maybe less. Then a faint series of taps against the wall, so soft they could have been inside the wood itself. 3. Pause. 3. I rose slow, the rifle already in hand. My voice sounded small when I spoke. Who's out there? The taps stopped. I waited until my heartbeat slowed, then stepped to the door. My hand hovered over the latch, then dropped. Instead, I went to the radio. Sabin Unit Morin calling base frequency. Any copy. I have confirmed seismic recurrence. Coordinates unchanged. Request verification. Static, then a faint crackle. For the first time in weeks, a voice came through, fragmented, distant. Morin. Copy. Signal unstable. Report. Say again, I said, leaning close. Get clear of. Then nothing but a burst of white noise so sharp it cut through the speaker like tearing metal. The smell of ozone filled the room. I pulled the plug. The dogs started barking again, wild this time, full-throated panic. I ran to the window. Their lines were stretched tight, all facing the ridge, barking at the same point in the distance. The ground shook once, sharp and brief, enough to rattle the lantern on its hook. The ridgeline flashed, just a shimmer, maybe light catching ice, but enough to throw a reflection against the sky. Then it was gone. I stood there until the dogs stopped. When calm finally returned, I noticed the smallest thing the logbook had shifted. It wasn't where I'd left it. Open now to a blank page. A fresh line of handwriting had appeared. Mine, but I hadn't written it. Follow the rules. I stared at it, tracing the indent of the pencil. The pressure was deep, the kind you leave when you press down too hard in the cold. It could have been from earlier, maybe when I leaned on it. It could have been anything. I tore the page out, fed it to the fire. The paper curled, blackened, vanished. After that I packed. Fuel, food, rifle, the journal, my father's note. If there was a cycle, it was due again soon, and I didn't plan to be here when it came. I stepped outside, clipped the dogs in harness. The air was unnaturally clear, the horizon sharp. The snow underfoot vibrated faintly, just enough to make the leash rings buzz. We started south along the line toward the old supply route. For the first time in months, the wind was behind me. 5 miles out, I stopped to rest. The dogs drank from melted snow, steam rising from their coats. I turned to look back. The cabin was a small dark square against the endless white. Something caught the light near the ridge. Movement, or the illusion of it. Too far to tell. Then the hum came again, softer this time, like a breath traveling through the snow. The dogs flattened their ears, and I realized it wasn't coming from the ridge anymore. It was under us. I loosened their harnesses, ready to move. The vibration built low and steady, the same 10-second pulse. Then it stopped, and a crack rippled through surface ice, running parallel to the river. The sled shifted. I hauled the dogs toward the tree line, away from the riverbed, just as the ice behind us caved with a muffled roar. Steam rose through the fissure, faint and gray, curling upward until it disappeared into the cold. When the echo died, the world went silent again. I didn't look back. We camped that night in a hollow of spruce, wind cutting through the branches. I built a fire, fed the dogs, wrapped myself in the sleeping bag. The stars overhead were so sharp they hurt to look at. I opened my father's note again. Read the last line under the firelight. Don't measure it. I understood now. Measuring is a kind of invitation. Some things you survive only by leaving them unobserved. I closed the note, slid it into the journal, and stared south until my eyes blurred. The wind turned sometime before morning. I woke to its new voice, a steady hiss through the spruce, carrying the dry rasp of blowing snow. The dogs had settled beside me, their bodies pressed tight for warmth. My legs ached from the previous day's pull. I sat up slow, joints stiff, and scanned the ridge to the north. The sky was washed bone, white, no horizon to tell ground from air. Somewhere behind it all, the sun was trying to rise. I packed camp anyway. The air tasted clean, and for the first time in days I felt distance between myself and the cabin, like static fading out of range. The plan was simple. Keep moving south until I crossed the line, where the satellite path passed overhead. Once I cleared the ridge, the radio might pick up Anchorage traffic. If I could get even a broken signal, someone would know I was still here. We moved until my breath came in clouds that froze before falling. The dogs pulled well, though Bryn lagged, old injury flaring. I stopped often to check the map, though everything looked the same. Snow on snow, shadow on shadow. By midday the wind shifted again, weaker but colder, slicing crosswise. The river bent west, forcing us up a slope where old survey markers still poked through the crust. I stopped at one, brushed off the snow, and found the same USGS stencil I'd seen near the crate, 83. Always the same year. I remembered my father's note, shell site per instruction. Maybe this was the border he meant, the line past which no one should build, or listen, or measure. By late afternoon the sky began to clear. Blue crept back, pale and sharp, and the sun finally appeared as a thin coin behind mist. I took it as a good sign. Then, just as the light touched the snow, I heard the first low tremor. It wasn't strong, just a shudder underfoot, a reminder that the earth here is always awake beneath the ice. The dogs stopped, heads low. I counted seconds in my head. 10. Then it passed. Keep moving, I said out loud, just to hear my own voice. We reached the ridge by evening. From there, the tundra stretched endless to the south, a frozen ocean. I could almost imagine the faint hum of the generator back at the cabin still riding the wind. I set up camp near a cluster of stones that jutted from the snow like broken teeth. The dogs circled close. The fire burned clean. I checked the radio again, tuning slowly across the bands. Static, static, then something faint. A voice. Copy. Hula hula. Repeat coordinates. I froze. It was weak, but there. I pressed the mic close. This is Morin. Cabin unit. I'm South Ridge, near old survey line. Do you read? Stead and clearer. Copy partial. You're in dead zone. Stay. The signal cut. The last word could have been station, or still, or nothing. I waited, adjusting the dial, but the frequency went silent. At least someone was out there. That was enough. When darkness came, I lay awake listening to the dogs breathing. The ground stayed still. No tremor, no echo. Only the steady pop of the fire. It should have been comforting, but the silence behind it felt wrong, hollow, like a note held too long after the song ends. I must have dozed. When I opened my eyes again, the fire had burned to coals. The dogs were standing alert, facing north. The wind had died. The air was thick with that same metallic taste from before the last collapse. Then came a sound soft, far off.
Not a tremor, a whistle. Long, human.
I sat up fast, flashlight sweeping the dark. Nothing but snow. The sound came again, clearer now from the direction of the river. 3 notes, spaced evenly. I called out before I could think. Who's there? No answer. Just the echo of my own voice returning through the valley. The dogs whined. I checked my watch. 03:15. The same cycle time. My pulse quickened. Then, through the haze of blowing snow, I saw a light. Weak at first, then stronger, moving slowly between the trees. It flickered, swayed, disappeared, reappeared higher on the slope. Someone carrying a lantern, or a headlamp swinging from a line. The dogs barked once, the sound swallowed by distance. I shouted again, hold where you are! I can see your light. It stopped. The glow steadied, hung there a long moment, then dipped once, like a nod, and went dark. The silence that followed felt alive. I stood there listening until the cold bit through my gloves. Nothing more came. Eventually, I went back to the fire and fed it, keeping watch until dawn. When the light returned, the valley looked untouched. No prints, no path, no light. Just the snow, smooth as glass. We moved again that day, south and a little west, hugging the higher ground to avoid thin ice. Around noon, the dogs started pulling harder, nostrils flaring. I thought they'd scented game until I caught it too. A faint tang of fuel on the air. Ahead, something metal glinted through the drifts. I tied the team and walked closer. A plane. Small, single engine, half-buried nose first into the ice. The paint was stripped by years of wind, but the tail number was visible. I recognized it from supply logs, the same company that flew our drops. The metal was clean of snow near the cockpit, as if someone had wiped it recently. Inside, the seats were torn, instruments dead. A thin layer of frost rimed the glass. On the floor sat a small emergency beacon. I turned it over. The battery indicator blinked weakly. 1 bar left. I switched it on. A faint hum rose, followed by a steady tone. Then, after a few seconds, a voice broke through. Emergency channel open. State condition. I almost laughed from relief. This is Caleb Morin, civilian outpost operator, Arctic Circle sector. Request extraction. Coordinates. I rattled them off, voice shaking. Copy, Morin. We have your location. Sit tight. Weather's closing in. We can reach you in 36 hours. Static, then silence. But it was enough. For the first time in weeks, I felt something unclench inside me. I built a small camp beside the wreck, melted snow for water, and waited. The hours stretched long. By the second night, clouds rolled back over the stars. The dogs grew restless again, shifting, whining at nothing. The ground held steady, though. No tremor, no hump. Maybe the cycle had ended with the collapse near the cabin. Still, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing my father's voice from that old tape. They're not for the weather. Near dawn, I heard the faint pop of ice shifting. Then, one after another, the dogs barked toward the north. I went outside, rifle ready. Across the open snow, far beyond the ridge, I saw a faint column of smoke rising. Thin, gray like breath. It came from the direction of the cabin. My chest went tight. I should have stayed where I was, waited for the plane. But curiosity is older than wisdom. It's what built this cabin, what buried those crates, what keeps any of us alive long enough to regret it. I marked my position with a flag, left the radio beacon on, and started back with Bryn and Arrow pulling light. We reached the ridge by midday. The smoke was gone, but the air had that same dull taste of thaw, iron and salt. The ground under my snowshoes felt soft. I stopped 50 yards short of the cabin. Where the porch should have been, there was nothing. Just a depression in the snow, round and smooth, as if the structure had melted straight down into the earth. No splintered wood, no debris. Only a rim of ice burned white by heat or pressure. The line that used to run from the door to the generator was still there, frozen mid-curve, disappearing into the hole. The dogs wouldn't go near it. They backed, tails down, whining. I crouched and peered closer. The hole descended maybe 12 feet before turning black. Warm air drifted up, carrying that same metallic tang. The rational part of me cataloged possibilities. Gas vent, methane pocket, collapse from thaw. But the edges were too clean, the circle too perfect. I stood there a long time, wind pushing snow across my boots until my fingers went numb. Then I did the only thing left that made sense. I turned away. We traveled south again, slow, cautious. The weather thickened. The sky pressed low, light fading early. I found a hollow to camp, sheltered from wind. That night, I wrote one final entry in the logbook. Southbound, distance approx. 40 miles from ridge. Radio contact made, extraction ETA 36 hours, cabin destroyed, cause unknown. Recovered all surviving records. Will deliver upon rescue. C. Morin. I set the book beside the fire and closed my eyes. When I woke, the radio beacon was beeping steady. A voice came through clearer than before. Morin, this is base anchorage. Aircraft inbound. Hold position. Relief hit so hard it made me dizzy. I packed fast, fed the dogs, and waited for the sound of engines. It came faint at first, then grew, a deep thrum cutting through the sky. The plane broke through the low cloud, circling once before lining up for approach. I waved my flare, smoke rising red against the gray. The dogs barked, tails high. The pilot touched down on the flats, snow swirling around the landing skis. When the door opened, a man leaned out, goggles fogged. Caleb Morin. He shouted over the engine. "That's me," I said. My voice cracked. He grinned, relief plane even through the frost. "We picked up your signal near an old crash beacon. Figured it was a glitch." I climbed aboard with the dogs. The cabin of the plane was warm, loud, smelling of fuel and canvas. As we lifted, I looked out the window one last time. The ridge was already shrinking to a thin, dark line, the world whitening around it. Then, just before clouds swallowed it completely, I saw it. One faint flash of light from the snow where the cabin had been. Not fire, not reflection. A single pulse. Two short, one long. The same pattern I'd seen weeks ago across the river. The pilot must have seen me staring. "You okay?" he asked. "Yeah," I said. "Just looking." He nodded, turned back to the instruments. The hum of the engine filled the cabin. I reached into my coat pocket and felt the edge of the paper still folded there. My father's last note, soft from handling. I read it once more, silently. "If you find what they left behind, leave it buried." Through the window, the Arctic stretched endless below, white, quiet, infinite. The rules still made sense up here. They always had.